Milo's Midnight Garden. There was a village that lived as if it had once been part of a dream and had simply never woken up. Tucked between two gentle hills, where the grass grew in soft waves and the trees whispered like sleepy storytellers, the village rested in the curve of the earth like a small, quiet sigh. Everything about it moved slowly, kindly, as if time itself walked barefoot down its cobbled streets. In the early evening, as the sun yawned and slipped behind the western hill, the village would glow. Not with lamps or lanterns, but with something softer. A glow that came from the way warm bread steamed in windowsills. The way the last bird sang not to call attention, but to say, good night. The way the sky, brushed in mauve and gold, gently pulled a blanket of stars around the rooftops. The houses here were small, round at the edges, with walls the color of butter and stone. Shutters painted in sleepy pastels, pale green, sky blue, and lilac faded by years of sun would creak closed one by one as twilight arrived. Chimneys puffed delicate trails of smoke, scented faintly with lavender or pine, as if the homes themselves were settling in for slumber. Cats curled like commas on windowsills. Children whispered secrets under quilts. Even the wind lowered its voice when it passed through. This was a village made not for rushing or noise, but for stillness, for the hush between moments. And in the last cottage on the last lane, where ivy clung lovingly to the roof tiles and moss grew in the creases of old stone, lived a boy named Milo. Milo was 7 years old, though he often felt older on the inside. Not because he knew big words or complicated things, but because he felt so very deeply. He didn't say much. Not because he couldn't, but because he listened more than he spoke. He listened to the wind tapping on his window, to the fire's soft breathing when the room was still, to the sound of pages turning even when the book was closed. His eyes were large and quiet, the color of river stones. His hair was soft brown, tousled like he had walked through a thought and forgotten to brush it away. Milo loved quiet things. The first snow that fell without a sound. The hush before a question. The way tea steamed from a cup like a memory leaving the body. And Milo, unlike most children in the village, didn't mind the dark. He didn't think night was scary or strange. To him, it was soft, comforting, full of space. The world feels wider when it's asleep, he once whispered to the moon. Each night, after supper, after his mother had tucked the quilt around his feet and kissed the top of his head, Milo would rise again, quiet as a feather drifting down. He would tiptoe to the small coat rack by the door, pull on his woolen boots, and wrap his favorite scarf twice around his neck. The scarf was hand-knitted by his grandmother, its ends slightly uneven, one side longer than the other, like two arms ready for an embrace. Milo never said where he was going, and no one asked, because somehow everyone knew this was his time. His wandering hour. The village at night was a different place than it was by day. Without the market bustle, the streets became slow rivers of stone. Lanterns flickered in windows like tired eyes blinking themselves shut. Fences that looked ordinary in sunlight now cast shadows shaped like lullabies. Milo would pass by the baker's house, where a candle always burned low, its scent a blend of sugar and ash. He would walk by the small post office, where envelopes slept quietly, waiting for morning hands to lift them. And he would wave to Mr. Clement, the old man who sat on his porch each night with a cup of warm milk and a blanket over his knees. Mr. Clement never said a word. He just smiled and lifted his cup, as if to say, "Yes, I see you, little moonwalker." Sometimes Milo would pause by the well in the village square, listening to the echo of water deep below. What do wells dream of? He wondered once. Do they dream of rain? Of buckets? Of being full again? These were the kinds of thoughts Milo had. Thoughts without loud edges. Thoughts that asked nothing, demanded nothing, only wished to be felt. Eventually, Milo's feet always carried him to the edge of the village, where the houses gave way to trees. The forest beyond the village was not dark and twisted like those in old stories. It was tall, gentle, ancient, The kind of place that stood still and listened to your heart before it let you pass. Milo never walked far in, just to the edge, just close enough to feel the trees breathing, close enough to wonder what they whispered to each other when the moon was full. And always at the edge, he would stop, not out of fear, but respect. He would close his eyes, he would take a breath, and he would feel the stillness gather around him like a second blanket. This was his favorite moment. Not the village, not the woods, but the place between them. That soft, quiet space where day became night, where the world paused to remember itself, where nothing was expected of you, only that you be. And Milo, in that space, felt whole. As he stood there, scarf fluttering gently, he couldn't know that tonight would be different. That the trees, usually still, would part just a little wider. That a path, hidden until now, would begin to glow beneath mossy steps. That something ancient and blooming had been waiting not loudly, but patiently for someone just like him. Someone who walked slowly, who asked softly, who listened with his whole heart. But for now, all Milo knew was this. The village behind him was safe and still. The forest ahead of him was full of mystery. And his heart, quiet, wondering, was ready to follow the hush. There is a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of thoughts, full of wonder, full of things you don't say out loud, but still carry with you like a stone warmed in your palm. Milo's heart was full of that kind of silence. He didn't talk much about his thoughts, not because they weren't important, but because they were soft. And soft things, he believed, should be handled gently. As he stood by the edge of the village, facing the trees that breathed with the rhythm of sleep, Milo's eyes reflected something more than night. They held questions, quiet ones. Why do some places feel like they're watching back? Why does night feel bigger than day? And why does my chest feel warm and tight at the same time, like I'm about to cry, even though I'm not sad? Milo didn't know where these questions came from. They simply appeared. When he stirred sugar into tea, when he listened to the wind press against the glass, when he heard his mother humming in the next room and suddenly wondered what it felt like to be old. He once tried to tell his teacher at school, "Sometimes I feel like the stars are whispering." The teacher smiled and patted his shoulder, saying, "That's lovely, Milo," and went back to grading papers. So Milo stopped trying to explain, not because he was hurt, but because he realized not everyone could hear what he heard. And that was okay. That night, as his boots crunched softly on the dew-damp path, Milo found himself thinking not with words, but with feelings. He felt the cold of the stone beneath his soles and wondered if the earth ever got lonely. He saw the flicker of a firefly and wondered if it knew it was beautiful. He smelled the faint vanilla from the baker's window and wondered if dreams had a taste. These were not questions he needed answered. They weren't puzzles to be solved. They were companions. They walked beside him like shadows, not frightening but familiar. At the little stone bridge over the stream, Milo paused. He leaned against the smooth curve of the railing, letting the silence settle in. Water whispered beneath him, soft and endless. He watched it for a while, then whispered, "What would it be like to float? To go wherever the water carries me without needing to decide where to stop?" The stream didn't answer, but it offered him a rhythm. And Milo listened, noticing how even the smallest splash had purpose. How every ripple returned to stillness. Maybe that's how I feel too, he thought. Like a ripple that's still figuring out where I came from. Milo continued walking, his scarf trailing gently in the wind. Past the bakery, past the library, past the little garden where daisies had already tucked themselves in for the night. He wasn't trying to reach anywhere. He was simply wondering. And his wondering made him feel more awake than any sunrise ever had. Some nights, Milo imagined he wasn't in the village at all, that he was somewhere else, a mountaintop, or a dream island made of feathers, or a hollowed-out cloud drifting over fields of sleeping sheep. In those places, he imagined meeting someone quiet like him. Someone who didn't speak right away. Someone who also asked questions without needing answers. wonders about me too? The idea made his chest ache, but not in a bad way. It was the kind of ache that came with hoping, with reaching, even if only inside your own mind. Back at the edge of the trees, Milo sat on a mossy rock and wrapped his arms around his knees. The trees loomed tall before him, not menacing, not stern, just tall, as if they had been there long before him and would still be there long after. He looked up at their dark silhouettes against the velvet sky. Do trees dream? He asked the silence. If they do, what do they dream of? Light? Rain? The weight of birds on their branches? He closed his eyes and listened. There was no answer, only wind brushing through the leaves. But somehow that was enough. Milo thought about the people in his village, the ones who rushed to work, the ones who laughed loudly and didn't notice when someone had been quiet too long, the ones who loved him but didn't always understand the way his heart worked. He didn't blame them. He didn't feel sad. He just felt apart, not alone, just like he was walking beside the world instead of in it. Is that okay? He wondered. To walk beside it, but not in it? He hugged his knees tighter. What if my place isn't in the crowd, but in the pause between footsteps? And then, suddenly, gently, another thought came. Not loud, not bright, but steady. What if there's a place made for someone like me? Not just a corner to hide in, not just a moment to pass through, but a space that felt like a heartbeat matching his own. A place that didn't need words, that welcomed questions, that didn't ask him to be louder or faster or brighter, just present. What if that place is waiting? His breath caught, not out of fear, but recognition. Milo stood slowly, scarf brushing his knees. And as he looked into the woods, really looked, he saw something. A shimmer, not quite light, not quite movement, but something that felt like a whisper returning to him. The trees, so still moments ago, now seemed to be listening back. Not watching, not testing, just listening, as if they, too, had been waiting for a boy who walked like a question. Milo took a step forward. The moss didn't crunch, it welcomed him. The air changed, softer, more aware, like breath just before a song. Am I dreaming, he wondered, or am I finally waking up? And in that pause, he felt something inside him open. Not wide, not loudly, just enough. Enough to let the wondering become something more. Not an answer, not a finish, but an invitation. And Milo, boy of quiet questions, steady feet, and soft stars in his chest, accepted it, not with words, but with a breath and a step toward the thing his heart had been reaching for without knowing its name. Toward a garden waiting in the dark. There are forests that feel wild, untamed, tangled with thorn and shadow. But this forest was different. It was old. Not old like broken things. Old like stories whispered too many times to forget. The trees stood tall and still, their trunks wide and wise, their bark carved with the quiet language of time. Moss clung gently to their roots like green scarves, and branches arched high above like cathedral ceilings, stitched together with stars. Milo stood at the threshold, the place where grass became moss, where moonlight softened into mist, where the world slowed and something else, something ancient, began. He took a breath, cool, deep, full of pine and promise. He stepped forward. The path didn't begin so much as reveal itself, thin and winding, tucked between trees that moved just slightly to let him pass. Milo didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was permission. And the forest, in return, began to speak not in words, but in whispers. The leaves rustled high above, not like wind, but like pages being turned. The trunks groaned softly, not from age, but from memory. The moss under his boots pulsed with warmth, as if remembering every footstep ever taken. Is this how trees speak? Milo wondered. Not with sound, but with feeling. He reached out and let his fingers trail against a trunk. It was rough, but alive, like skin that had learned to weather storms. And for a moment, he felt something. A flicker, a hum, a pulse, faint and deep beneath the bark, as if the tree had a heartbeat, as if it had waited a very long time to be touched. Milo closed his eyes. He could feel the forest, not just around him, but within him. Every branch above, like a thought stretching higher. Every root below, like a feeling that had never found words. The air was full of things that could not be named, but could be understood. And the trees began to whisper. Not all at once, not like a crowd, but like old friends waking gently from a long sleep. They didn't say his name, but they didn't have to. They knew him. They knew the boy with the questions. The one who listened before he asked. The one who carried silence the way others carried swords or shields. And in return for his gentleness, they opened. A path appeared lined with moss that glowed faintly, like moonlight stored in soil. It wound through the trees, curving softly, invitingly, as if it had always been there, just hidden. Milo hesitated, not out of fear, but awe, because something deep in his chest, a part of him that had always been quiet, suddenly felt heard. They see me, he thought. The trees see me. He stepped forward again, the moss springing gently beneath his weight. He felt lighter now, like each step peeled away something heavy he didn't know he'd been carrying. He walked in silence, but the forest around him was full of song. Not music exactly, but harmony. The way one tree answered another in creaks. The way leaves brushed against each other like lullabies. The way the earth breathed in and out in slow, steady rhythm. It was not scary. It was sacred. And Milo, for the first time, felt like he belonged somewhere not because he fit in, but because he was exactly who he was. Quiet, wondering, soft, present. The path turned once more, wider now. Ahead, through a veil of mist and moonbeams, something shimmered. A clearing, a breath held by the forest, and in the center of that breath, something waited. Milo didn't run. He walked, because some places are not meant to be rushed toward. Some places ask to be met slowly, with reverence. And so, he came to the edge of the clearing, and paused, because just ahead, the trees stopped whispering, and something else, something even gentler, had begun to hum. Milo exhaled, his heart full. He didn't know what he was about to see, but he knew, deep in his bones, it was not an accident he'd found the path. The forest had called him, had waited for him, had opened for him, because sometimes the trees know things before we do, and they whisper only to those who remember how to listen. There are moments in life when time forgets to move, when the air thickens with wonder, when the world becomes so still, even your breath feels like a question. Milo had stepped into one of those moments. The forest had guided him gently, like a grandmother's hand, and now the trees had parted. What lay before him was not a field or a clearing. It was a secret, a breath held by the earth, a space that had been waiting, a garden. Milo stopped at the very edge. He blinked. Once, twice. Not because he was afraid, but because he wasn't sure if what he was seeing was real. Before him stretched a garden unlike any garden he had ever known. The ground shimmered faintly beneath a thin veil of mist. The plants were tall and curling, their leaves a mix of silver, indigo, and velvet green. Flowers slowly opened in slow motion, as if woken gently from the longest dream. They glowed, not brightly, but softly, like their petals had caught moonlight and were letting it go in small size. Some flowers were the size of teacups, their centers sparkling like stardust. Others were no larger than a thumbprint, shaped like sleepy bells nodding in rhythm with the air. Everything pulsed with a slow, steady energy, as if the garden itself was breathing. Above the blooms floated dozens, no, hundreds of fireflies. But they weren't like the ones from the village fields. These moved slowly, deliberately, weaving trails of golden light through the air like glowing ribbons. They drifted in swirls and spirals, spelling shapes that shimmered before fading into the night. A sleeping cat curled on a leaf, a boat made of petals drifting on a star. A small boy, hands open, standing at the edge of a garden. Milo watched them, breath caught between his ribs. They know I'm here, he thought. They've always known. He stepped forward onto the moss. It didn't crunch. It didn't shift. It welcomed him. The air smelled faintly of lavender and something else, something unfamiliar but comforting, like the scent of pages in a book you loved as a child but had forgotten until now. Is this real? He wondered. Then he smiled. No, it's something better than real. He walked slowly, reverently, among the flowers, and as he did, something extraordinary happened. The flowers moved, not quickly, not with any sound, but gently, just enough to turn toward him. Their petals swayed ever so slightly as if acknowledging his presence. Not demanding, not fearful, simply recognizing. Milo crouched down beside a cluster of soft golden blooms shaped like tiny stars. One of them slowly opened wider, revealing a faint glow inside, like it had caught a tiny sunrise and decided to keep it. He reached out and placed his hand just above the blossom. It warmed the space between them. He didn't touch it. He didn't need to. Something passed between them, an understanding, a greeting. You're safe here, the flowers seemed to say, and in return, Milo whispered, I see you. He sat down on the moss, legs folded, scarf trailing beside him like a comet's tail. The fireflies continued their slow dance above. More shapes now. A mother rocking a child in a crescent moon. A rabbit sleeping in a hollow made of feathers. A candle burning steadily in a window during storm. Stories, not spoken, but shown. They're telling me dreams, Milo thought. Or maybe, the dreams people forget when they wake up. He lay down on his back, staring up at the velvet sky. The stars blinked gently, reflected in the garden's glowing blossoms. And for the first time in his life, Milo felt completely seen. Not just noticed, not just liked, seen. This garden doesn't care if I speak loudly or not, he thought. It doesn't care that I ask strange questions or walk too slowly. It doesn't want me to be anything but what I already am. His eyes welled quietly, but he didn't wipe them. The tears weren't sad. They were full of softness, of wonder, of finally feeling like he had found the place his heart had always whispered about when no one was listening. He stayed there in that quiet glow for what felt like both hours and seconds. He didn't need to measure time. There was no ticking in this place. No rules. No rush. Just the garden. Just the fireflies. Just his own small, precious breath. And when the breeze began to shift, cooler now, signaling that night was reaching its deepest part, Milo sat up once more. He whispered thank you to no one in particular, and the flowers bowed. As he turned to leave, he noticed something drifting toward him. A petal, soft, golden, and glowing from within. It floated through the air like a feather and gently landed in his open hand. Warm, light, steady. He held it against his chest and felt its glow spread softly through him, like a lullaby written in light. He tucked the petal carefully into the pocket of his coat and walked slowly back through the trees. The path lit itself beneath his steps, just enough to guide him. The forest was silent again, but now not out of mystery, out of peace. And as the trees closed gently behind him, Milo felt something settle deep inside him. A promise that he would return, because some places don't just exist in the world, they exist in you. And when they bloom forever. There are sounds so soft, so delicate, that they feel more like feelings than noise. A sigh from a candle, the hush of a dream before it begins, the whisper of petals unfolding in the dark. Milo sat in the heart of the midnight garden, knees pulled to his chest, scarf tucked around him like a second hug. Above him, the fireflies danced their golden stories, fading into gentle spirals. The night sky watched with a patient kind of stillness, like a guardian who needed no words. Around him, the garden glowed quietly. The air shimmered, not with heat, but with something gentler, like a presence. happened. Not suddenly, not loudly, but gently, like the very first note of a lullaby. It came from the flowers, the golden ones, the star-shaped ones, the soft lavender blooms each began to hum, just barely above silence. The sound was warm, soft, impossible to describe, and yet instantly familiar. It wasn't a song with words, but it was music. It vibrated in the air like kindness. It tickled Milo's fingertips and curled in his ears like a whispered story from long ago. It brushed over his heart like fingers across the strings of a harp. He didn't move. He didn't even blink. Because something in him, a deep, quiet part, knew. This was not music for dancing. This was music for listening. He leaned forward, closer to a cluster of dusky blue blossoms. They tilted toward him. Their petals trembled as they sang, not with voice, but with vibration, like the air around them was part of the song itself. Milo closed his eyes, and in the music he saw a cradle rocking gently under moonlight, a field of dandelions sighing into the sky, a lantern being lit in a window by a hand filled with hope. Each note carried something deeper than sound: memory, comfort, belonging. He opened his eyes again and whispered, "Are you singing to me?" Not a yes, not a no, a feeling, a glow, a softness in the air. Milo smiled. His eyes were wet, but he didn't feel like crying. He felt like being held, like the garden, through its music, had wrapped invisible arms around his shoulders and said, "You matter, even when you're quiet, even when no one sees you. Even when your thoughts are too big for your mouth to hold." And Milo, small and still among the blooming music, believed it. He lay back in the moss again, letting the sound rise above him like stars rearranging themselves into lullabies. He didn't try to understand it. He let it pass through him, like warmth, like night, like breath. And in that quiet listening, he began to feel something else, connected. Not to one flower, or even just to the garden, but to something larger, something older than the trees, softer than sleep, a kind of music that had always existed, but had waited for the right ears to hear it. Is this what dreams are made of? Milo wondered. Not stories, but songs we forgot we knew. Sound cue, garden melody shifts into a gentle pulse, like a slow heartbeat made of song. He imagined the music drifting beyond the trees, over the hills, across the roofs of the village, sliding through cracked windows, nestling under pillows, wrapping itself around those who couldn't sleep. He saw Mrs. Ellery, the postwoman, turning over in her bed and pausing, her breathing slowing. He saw little Benji down the lane, his face smoothing into peace as the notes brushed against his dreams. He saw his own mother, sitting by the window with a cup of tea gone cold, eyes distant, suddenly blinking, as if a memory had brushed her cheek. They're hearing it too, Milo thought, even if they don't know it. And that thought, that knowing, filled him with something even greater than joy. Purpose. Not loud, not heroic, but quiet, steady, real. He didn't need to change the world. He only needed to tend to this garden, to listen to it, to love it, to let it sing through him. As the night deepened and the air cooled, the song grew fainter, not because it was gone, but because it was going elsewhere. Carried on the wind, passed from blossom to breeze, from firefly to star, from silence into dreams. Milo sat up slowly. He looked around. The flowers were still, resting now. Their petals glowed faintly with the warmth of the song they had sung. He stood, brushing moss from his coat, and placed a hand on his chest. He could still feel the hum inside him, a quiet echo, a gentle rhythm. He whispered, "Thank you," not sure if it was enough, but knowing it was real. The flowers did not bow. They didn't need to, because the garden had already given him something precious. Not answers, but music. And music, Milo now understood, was another way of saying, "I'm here." Not every night is the same. Some carry joy like laughter in the air. Some are heavy with questions, and some arrive quietly, holding nothing but silence. The night after the flowers sang, Milo returned to the midnight garden. His scarf wrapped tight, his coat buttoned, his heart glowing with memory. He had carried the garden inside him all day, its songs, its shimmering petals, its warmth that hummed like a lullaby behind his ribs. He was ready to greet it again, ready to listen, ready to give thanks. But the garden was still. Milo stepped into the clearing slowly. The mist was thinner. The glow was dim. The flowers, those same magical blooms, were closed. Not wilted, not harmed, just quiet. Their petals folded inward like hands in sleep. Their colors dulled, as if the moonlight had turned away for the night. And the fireflies? He waited for the hum to return,
No soft
for a
spirals,
single petal to
no
tremble,
glowing stories.
for the faintest
Only
lullaby
air,
to begin again.
still,
But nothing
cool,
came.
empty.
Did I do something wrong?
Milo
He
stood
thought.
there,
He
waiting.
stepped softly into the grass, crouched beside a flower he had spoken to just the night before, a blossom shaped like a tiny star. He whispered, "Hello." No answer. He tried again. "It's me, Milo." Still silence. No movement. No song. He sat down slowly, his legs crossed, his hands folded in his lap. And for the first time in many nights, he didn't feel wonder. He felt unsure. Did I imagine it? Was it a dream after all? Was I only meant to see the garden once? The questions wrapped around him like fog. His heart, which had been so full, now felt hollow in places. Not broken, just quiet in a way that made him ache. He rested his head on his knees. The moss beneath him was still soft, the air still sweet, but everything felt far away. Why won't it wake up? He wondered. What changed? And then a colder thought came. Maybe I'm not enough. He didn't cry, but his breath slowed. His eyes felt heavy, not from sleep, but from feeling too much at once. He looked up at the sky. The stars were still there, still blinking, still watching, but they felt distant tonight. Not cruel, just far. He lay down in the moss and stared up. Maybe the garden gave me one night, he thought. Maybe that was all it had to give. And he whispered, so softly the wind barely heard it. "Please, come back." But the garden didn't answer, because sometimes the most magical places must rest, too. After a long time, Milo sat back up. His knees ached from the cold. His hands were tucked into his sleeves. He looked around once more, hoping, just hoping, for the tiniest flicker of gold. But the flowers stayed closed. And that's when something shifted, not in the garden, but in Milo. A thought, soft as petals, bloomed inside him. What if the garden didn't forget me? What if it's not gone, just tired? What if magic needs space to breathe too? He turned to a flower with pale blue petals and said gently, "It's okay to rest." And as soon as he spoke those words, something inside him eased. He stood up and brushed the moss from his coat. "I'll come back," he said softly. "I won't ask you to shine. I'll just be here." The garden remained silent, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like a friend who had fallen asleep, a presence that still held space for him, even in quiet. As Milo walked back through the trees, the path didn't glow tonight, but it was still there, waiting, unchanged. And the stars, though still distant, twinkled a little brighter near the horizon, as if they, too, were listening. That night, back in his small room, Milo didn't place the glowing petal beneath his pillow. He set it on the windowsill, beside a small jar of dried leaves and tiny stones from his walks. He whispered, "You can rest too," and tucked himself under his blanket. And though there was no song in the air and no shimmer in the dark, Milo felt something else. Stillness. Not the stillness of loss, but the stillness of trust. Because sometimes love doesn't bloom in every moment. Sometimes it pauses and waits, just like a garden, just like a boy named Milo. Certainly, the next evening, Milo came back. He didn't know what to expect. He didn't carry hope the way he had before, like a balloon straining toward the sky. Instead, he held it gently lower, closer to the ground, like a seed cupped in his hand. He walked quietly beneath the trees, whose trunks no longer shimmered, but still stood tall and watching. The forest made no promises, but it offered space, and that, Milo had come to understand, was a kind of kindness. Milo had brought something new with him tonight, a small watering can. It was dented on one side and still smelled faintly of mint leaves. He had found it in the back corner of the garden behind his house. Forgotten, dusty, waiting. Just like the garden, he thought. He'd filled it at the stream before entering the forest, careful not to spill a drop. And now he stood at the edge of the midnight garden once again. It was still. The petals still closed. The air still quiet. The fireflies still gone. But Milo didn't feel disappointed. He stepped forward and began to water. He didn't rush. He didn't expect. He simply knelt beside the first flower, the one shaped like a tiny star, and let the water fall at its roots. Then the next, and the next. Each flower, each leaf, was treated with the same care. "You don't have to sing tonight," he whispered. "I'll take care of you anyway." He moved through the garden like a hush with footsteps. And something inside him began to change. Not loudly, but slowly, like a frost melting, like a breath deepening, like a boy realizing that love isn't always a spark, it's a fire you feed, gently every day. The flowers didn't open, but something else did. A space inside Milo. A space that used to ask, "Am I enough?" Now whispered, "I am here." And that is enough. He finished watering, then sat down in the moss, placing the empty can beside him. He didn't talk much after that. He just sat, with his hands in his lap, with the sky darkening above him, with the garden still and silent around him. And in that silence, he felt something new. Peace. Not because the garden had bloomed, not because the magic had returned, but because he was doing something small, something loving, something steady. He looked down at the ground and imagined the roots below, tangled, slow, patient. Maybe they're growing even when I can't see, he thought. Maybe magic works like that too. He placed his palm flat on the moss and whispered, "You can take your time." And somehow, the earth felt a little warmer under his touch. Back in the village, people were already asleep. The baker dreamed of clouds made from flour. The postwoman dreamed of postcards that fluttered like birds. Even little Benji down the lane dreamed of a boat made of stars. And Milo? He wasn't dreaming yet. He was giving. Before he left the garden that night, Milo took out a small object from his coat pocket. It was a pebble, smooth, round, and warm from having been held. He placed it at the base of the sleeping blue blossom. "For you," he said, "just to know I came." Not because the flower would understand, not because it would bloom immediately, but because love, when given freely, always leaves something behind. Even if it's small, even if it's quiet. He stood up, gave the garden a small bow just like the old man in town had taught him after chess games, and turned to leave. And as he stepped through the trees, the moss didn't glow, but it felt softer. The air didn't sing, but it carried his steps gently. And the garden didn't bloom, but it remembered. That night, Milo placed the empty watering can by his bed. He didn't need dreams to show him the garden. He had been there. He had given something real. And even though the flowers had not sung, his heart had, quietly, steadily, like a gardener's heart should. Because sometimes the greatest magic isn't what we see, it's what we stay for. Absolutely. Below is the detailed storytelling script for. The garden hadn't bloomed in days. No flowers opened. No songs floated through the air. The fireflies remained quiet, tucked away in sleep. And yet, Milo returned every night. He carried his little watering can, filled with stream water. He knelt at each plant, greeted them by name, names he'd given quietly to each one. He spoke in whispers. He sang sometimes. And he stayed long after the sky turned black and the stars grew tired. He never asked the garden to bloom again, because he had learned something now, something real. Love doesn't ask to be noticed. It simply stays. And then, one morning, something began to change. Not in the garden, but in the village. It started with Mrs. Ellery, the old postwoman. She awoke in her small, creaky bed with her cat curled against her legs and tears on her cheeks, not sad tears, but the kind that come when something forgotten returns. "I dreamt I was a girl again," she said aloud, her voice catching. "I was running through fields of glowing flowers, and the air smelled like warm stars." Her cat blinked once and purred, as if it had seen it too. Later that day, young Benji from down the lane tugged at his mother's sleeve. "I saw lights last night, Mama. Not the usual kind. They were dancing and spelling pictures." His mother laughed gently. "Sounds like a lovely dream." But Benji shook his head. It didn't feel like dreaming. It felt like the lights were real. And across the street, the baker's daughter whispered to her brother that she'd heard music while she slept, music that sounded like flowers humming lullabies. Word spread, not quickly, but sweetly, like honey melting on warm bread. No one knew why they were dreaming more vividly. No one could explain why their sleep felt softer. But the village, little by little, began to shift. The butcher placed wildflowers in his window, just because. The librarian began setting out picture books filled with stars and meadows. Even the grumpy cobbler started humming, though he denied it every time someone noticed. And each night, as the village drifted off to sleep, a hush would settle over the rooftops, a hush that glowed. Back in the garden, Milo didn't know any of this. He was still kneeling by the moss, still whispering to the quiet leaves, still pressing his hand to the ground to feel the thrum of the earth beneath. The flowers hadn't changed, but he had, because love, when offered freely, doesn't shrink when unreturned. It deepens. It roots. One night, as he poured water beside a sleepy blossom with pale violet petals, he felt something shift in the air. Not a sound, not a flash, but a feeling, a weight lifting, a lightness settling. He sat back on his heels and looked around. The garden was still quiet, but no longer silent. There was something alive in the hush. He closed his eyes, and suddenly, in the darkness behind his eyelids, he saw them, the dreams. Not his, but theirs. Mrs. Ellery, dancing in the middle of a moonlit glade, arms raised toward constellations. Benji floating above a silver stream in a boat made of a dandelion puff. The baker curled up beside a bush of bread-scented blossoms, sleeping soundly with flour on his cheeks. Milo gasped softly. They found the garden, he thought, or the garden found them. Tears welled again, not from sorrow, not even from joy, but from something else, fulfillment. The quiet knowing that what you love has begun to love others too, even if they never see you, even if they never know your name. He turned toward the sound and saw it. A single bloom had opened, small, pale, gentle, but blooming. Just one, and Milo didn't rush to it. He didn't cheer or cry or clap. He simply knelt beside it and whispered, "Welcome back." And from that night forward, things began to shift, both in the garden and in the world beyond it. More dreams began to bloom. They came as stories told over breakfast, as paintings in chalk on cobblestones, as quiet smiles exchanged between neighbors who once passed by with their heads down. No one knew where the dreams came from, but everyone felt them, like a secret too beautiful to name. And Milo? He kept coming. He watered. He listened. He sat in silence when the garden needed rest, because by now he knew the truth. Gardens don't bloom because we ask them to. They bloom because someone stays to care for them. And love, real love, is never wasted. Even if it hides, even if it sleeps, even if it takes root in someone else's dream. Because when love is patient, when it's quiet and consistent, when it asks for nothing in return, it grows. And sometimes it blooms in sleep. The midnight garden never made a sound the village could hear. No bells rang. No trumpet blooms announced its return. No golden signs appeared in the sky. And yet, it lived on. Not just in petals, not just in dreams, but in the quiet rhythm of people remembering how to be gentle. It began slowly. A little boy left his drawing of a flower outside the bakery, taped gently to the door with a leaf. An elderly couple, who hadn't walked beyond their fence in months, began strolling each morning, never speaking much, but always smiling more than before. Children in the schoolyard began making up bedtime songs with no words, humming them into the wind and claiming they had heard them in sleep. No one knew what started it. No one mentioned a garden. But somehow it was there, threaded into everything. The librarian rearranged her entire window display one morning. Gone were the thick tomes with dusty covers. In their place, books about dreams, soft colors, stories with stars in the margins. She didn't say why, only that lately she felt the need to put gentler things in the front. And when asked if there was a reason, she paused and said, "It's just something in the air." Even the grumpy cobbler, who had once claimed sleep was for cats and poets, began humming to himself as he worked. Sometimes he paused with his needle mid-stitch and stared out the window, eyes misty. One morning, a child asked him what he was humming, and he said, almost surprised, "I think it's a flower song." No one mentioned Milo, not because they forgot him, but because they didn't know. He never told anyone. He still slipped out each night, just as the village curled into sleep. His scarf looped twice, his watering can swinging gently in his hand, his steps quiet, steady, the same way he had always gone. And yet, something in him was different now. He no longer looked toward the garden for magic. He simply came because it was part of him, like breath, like dreaming, like tending something you love, whether or not it blooms. Some nights, the garden greeted him with petals wide and glowing. Some nights, it simply rested, content to listen. And some nights, it opened just one flower, just enough to remind him, "I'm still here." You don't need proof to believe. Milo began leaving small things in the garden. A story he had written on a folded scrap of paper. A dried orange slice tied with string. A button from a coat he'd outgrown, placed beside a blue blossom he called Old Friend. He didn't expect anything in return. The giving was the magic. And somehow, though no one in the village had ever seen the garden with their eyes, they began to feel it in their bones. People slept more deeply, dreamed more softly, woke with words on their lips they couldn't quite explain. Some wrote them down, some forgot them by breakfast, but all of them felt lighter, like they had been held in the night by something ancient, something blooming, something that knew them. One evening, a letter arrived at the baker's shop with no return address. Inside was a drawing, a boy in a glowing garden, surrounded by humming flowers, his scarf fluttering gently in the moonlight. The baker looked at it for a long time, then pinned it beside the bread oven and whispered, "Thank you, whoever you are." The truth was this: the garden never needed to be seen to be real. It had become part of the village's rhythm, a presence without a name, a feeling without a shape, a quiet reminder that gentleness, given freely, blooms in places you'll never see. And Milo, he never stopped going. Not even when he grew taller. Not even when his scarf became too short. Not even when people began to wonder if he'd outgrown such quiet things. Because deep down, he knew, some things are worth tending for a lifetime, even if they only bloom in the dark. Even if they only bloom in others. And every night, just as he set down his watering can and looked out across the quiet clearing, Milo would close his eyes and think, "Let this bloom not for me, but for them." And somewhere, in a room with an open window and a slowly rising chest, someone dreamed. The night was full, but not loud. It didn't rush. It didn't pull. It simply was wrapped around the trees and rooftops like a well-worn quilt. And down the winding path, through the woods that swayed like slow dancers, walked Milo. His boots barely touched the moss now, like he had learned to move with the rhythm of the garden. His scarf trailed behind him like a ribbon of sleep. His watering can, empty and swinging gently in his hand, made a soft tap with each step. He wasn't in a hurry. He had all the time the stars would give him. The garden hadn't sung tonight. It hadn't glowed. It hadn't shimmered. It had simply rested. And so had Milo. He had sat for a while, quietly. He had traced his finger in the dirt beside a flower stem. He had closed his eyes and listened, not for music, but for presence. And what he had felt was more precious than a song. He had felt belonging. Not the kind you ask for. The kind that greets you without needing a word. Now he reached the edge of the trees. The forest behind him sighed softly, as if exhaling him home. The village below slept. The windows were dim. The roofs curled in moonlight. Somewhere, a cat turned in its sleep and settled again. Somewhere, a child dreamed of walking through stars with bare feet. And Milo walked down the lane toward his little house at the end, his heart full of quiet. Not full like a balloon, full like a cup that had been sipped from slowly refilled with meaning. He stepped inside, closed the door, unwrapped his scarf. The house was warm, not from a fire, from memory, the way it always was after his garden walks. He set the watering can beside the door and tiptoed up to his room. No candle needed. He could find his way in the dark now. The darkness wasn't empty anymore. It was full of knowing. In his room, the stars blinked through the window above his bed. The same stars that blinked above the garden.